You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about marriage. I thought this would be interesting to talk about because I have changed my mind massively in my life about marriage and what it means. I am married now, and it's a really important part of my life, and I view it very positively. But I did grow up with a view of marriage that was very, very different. Growing up, I learned the idea that marriage is a very outdated tradition, and it's a sort of defunct institution that was from olden times, and it was about the subjugation of women and treating women as property, and it was a religious thing, and mainly it was just kind of a leftover from olden times. So it's kind of this slightly ridiculous, a little bit quaint institution that didn't really have any purpose in the modern world. That was the view that I had of marriage growing up. My parents were never married, and most of my friends growing up were either from divorced parents or parents who hadn't been married in the first place. Although when I was growing up in the 1970s, having parents who were never married was still a relatively small proportion of all families. It's now obviously much, much bigger. My parents were not just indifferent to marriage, they were outright hostile to it. I think they considered it to be a symbol of subjugation of women. And it was sort of a cultural statement of my parents to not get married and to be against marriage on ideological grounds. They saw it as a bad institution. So that was the view that I grew up with. And as you probably know, if you listen to my podcast, I am married now. So as you can see, I changed my view very significantly. And it took a long period of time for me to change my view about marriage. And now I feel very positively about being married. And I also know that there are lots of things about marriage that I didn't understand and hadn't really thought through when I thought of it negatively, in the same way as my parents did and the people around me did when I was growing up. So I thought I'd share with you the change of views that I had about marriage and some of the things that I came to realize about it, in case that helps you in thinking about whether or not marriage is relevant for you and whether or not you want to get married. I'd like to start by making a very important distinction that might sound obvious, but I think to many people it's not. There are two different types of marriage. There are coercive marriages and there are voluntary marriages. Coercive marriages are marriages that are not done with the consent of both the husband and the bride. And this was very prevalent in pre-industrial times, and it still takes place around the world today. There are marriages that are coercive, they're forced, they have nothing to do with the preferences of the man or woman getting married. They're often a matter of tribal or family politics, and children are married by their parents. Children are often pressured into arranged marriages, essentially to meet the needs of the parents and the older generation, and not the needs of the kids. So coercive marriages do exist. They were way more prevalent in pre-industrial societies, but they still exist in certain places in the world now. But then, of course, there are voluntary marriages, and this is what marriage has come to mean in the West. A voluntary marriage is one where both the husband and the wife consent to getting married. They both want to and choose to, and nobody else is forcing you to do it. So in this episode, I'm talking about voluntary marriage. Marriages in the West. And as I'm talking about my own experience, I'm going to be talking about heterosexual marriage. That is the vast majority of marriages. I've got nothing against gay marriage, but I'm just focusing on this question from my own perspective. So first of all, let's talk about exactly what marriage is, because this is something that I had to get straight in my own head. Because as I mentioned, I had lots of ideas about how historically marriage had been about the subjugation of women and all this kind of stuff. And in many ways, that's true of coercive marriages still in those places in the world where coercive marriages do take place. But if you're talking about a voluntary marriage in the West where you get to choose your partner and decide whether or not you are going to get married, what exactly are you doing when you get married? What is a voluntary marriage like those that happen in the West where you get the chance to choose? Well, to me, there are two key aspects of what marriage is. Firstly, it's a commitment that you make to each other. And the commitment is we are going to work on any problems that come up. We're going to stay together if times get tough and if things are bad, and we're going to work it out. That's the commitment that you're making to each other. And the second aspect of a marriage is it's a public declaration of that commitment. So it's not something that you just work out between you and your partner, but you're also telling the world, we've made a commitment to each other. Neither of us are available, and we're both making it very clear that we've made this choice to make this commitment to each other. So that's what a marriage is. And I know that a lot of people would take that definition of what marriage is and say, well, why do I need a marriage in order to make a commitment to my partner? I can just decide to stay in a relationship. You don't need to get married, and it's not going to guarantee your commitment to get married. And in fact, there's quite a funny sketch by Doug Stanhope talking about marriage. And he's essentially making that point that, you're having this big party to celebrate your relationship. And in his criticism is, this is just purely self-indulgent. You're just making this all about you and celebrating your relationship. And why do you need to bother doing that in the first place? Why can't you just get on with it? And indeed, I had the same criticisms of marriage myself. So now I'm going to explain to you why I think it's important to consider marriage. The reason is that the biggest question facing any relationship that you have is probably going to be, are you going to have kids with this person? The vast majority of people do want to have kids. I think worldwide it's about 89.6% of people have kids, and it's slightly higher in developing countries, and it's lower in more developed countries, especially in the West. So, for example, in the United States, by their early 40s, I think about 83% of US women have had kids. But that's still the vast majority. So if you judge people by their actions, most people do choose to have kids. And if you're in a relationship, that is a question for you. Are you going to have kids with this person? And this is where I think marriage actually is something that is an incredibly positive and important thing to consider if you're serious about having kids. If you are going to have kids, regardless of your attitudes towards sharing responsibilities, there is an absolutely clear biological fact that having kids is way more onerous on women than it is on men. And it always will be, regardless of the intentions of both people involved, simply because of the logistics of what is involved in having a baby. So first of all, you have the pregnancy. Obviously, the woman is going to be the one bearing the child for the pregnancy. But in some pregnancies, if you get a condition called hyperemesis gravidarum, I think it's called, you could be throwing up every day throughout the pregnancy. I mean, that is a serious physical burden for months. Then, of course, you have the birth itself, which is another enormous physical burden that the woman is going to bear. And not only is it the birth, but, there's a lot of injury can happen during birth, and you're going to need time to recover from the injury. And then not only that, but you have, after the birth, you have breastfeeding, which is very important for the psychological and physical well-being of the baby. And current best practice guidelines are that you should breastfeed for up to 2 years after birth. So just the physical reality of having a baby means that it's a way more onerous task for a woman, and it always will be, because those physical things you cannot divide, you can't share up. It's always going to be the woman who's doing those things. And what that means is that if you're going to have kids, the woman's taking on way more risk and way more responsibility, just taking into account pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding, let alone all of the other aspects of motherhood. And of course, that is going to massively impact on her career, her opportunities for making money. Just that physical challenge alone is going to have a much bigger impact on her than the guy who's going to become a father, but who's not going to go through pregnancy, he's not going to go through childbirth, he's not going to have the injuries after childbirth, he's not going to be doing the breastfeeding. So when you take that into account, marriage is like an insurance policy for women before having kids. It's an insurance policy that says, if we're going to do this, we're going to stay together. because it's going to be an enormous risk on the woman. And so consequently, it's a way of basically making a commitment that says, right, we're going to have kids, and the guy is not going to just wander off and become a deadbeat dad afterwards. To me, that's one of the most important things that makes sense about the commitment of marriage. It's an insurance policy for women. It's also, to a certain extent, an insurance policy for men, because it's establishing that you intend to stay together if you're going to have kids. And that's important for men because the fact that women have the physical burdens of childbirth also means that the involvement of men in the actual process of making a baby is a pretty short one. And what that means is that if a woman wants to have a kid, then in practically speaking, after having sex, she can more or less go away and have a kid with no further involvement of the man if she really wants to and doesn't want the guy involved. So if you're a man and you want to have a relationship with your kids and you want to be involved in being a parent and know that you have a relationship with your kids, a marriage is also a way of making a commitment which says, yeah, we're both going to be here for this process. And it's a way that the woman is making a commitment to the man to say, I'm not going to take the kids and just go off and do my thing. I do make a commitment to stay together with you, so we're going to have a family together. But the thing about marriage that I really didn't understand, that's even more important than the role that it plays for the man and the woman, is what the role that it plays for kids. If you do want to have kids, marriage is a commitment to stay together for your kids. Because obviously kids want their parents to be 100% committed to staying their parents. Kids do not want their parents to break up, find new partners, discover new interests in life, and generally get bored of the whole project of being a parent. Kids want their parents to be totally committed to being their parents. And for kids, this is not just a preference. This is a matter of life or death. Through evolution, we have instincts to tell us that if our parents are not interested in parenting us anymore, then we're in trouble. Instinctively, we know as children that we are incredibly vulnerable. So the threat of your parents leaving feels to children like an existential threat. Even if as kids you can rationally understand that you're not going to die and things are going to be okay, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like your world is falling apart and you are exposed to all manner of new risks. And who knows what kind of terrible risks you're going to be confronted with because you're taking it to a step into a dangerous unknown. That's how it felt to me when my parents broke up. So that's what I think is really important about marriage is it's a matter of making a commitment. If you are going to embark on the biggest project of your life, which is to have a family, if you're going to do that, then you want to know that you're on the same side, that you're both committed to this project, and your kids want to know that too. It's like planning a mission to Mars. If you were going to plan a mission to Mars and you knew that you had to spend all that time on a spaceship on the way to Mars, establish the settlement, get everything up and running, you would want people who you're going to undertake that venture with to be seriously committed to making this thing work. You'd want people who were going to be really dedicated to dealing with problems if they come up and getting to Mars and establishing your colony and all of that. And it's the same if you want to start a family. It's a massive, massive undertaking. There's a huge amount of responsibility. If you're bringing kids into the world, you owe them a massive responsibility. So to me, this is what marriage really says. It says, I am willing to go through the difficulties that we might encounter together because I'm committed. So that's how I changed my views about marriage. A lot of it was to do with me thinking about what is involved in starting a family, what's involved in having kids. If you never want to have kids, and if you just choose to have a relationship, but you both never want to have kids, you can totally get married. And I think there are great benefits from making a commitment to work on your problems. I think it actually is a really positive thing to do. And it may be that you want to undertake projects together that are big commitments, like buying a house and doing other things that are not the same kind of commitment as having kids, but that it actually makes sense to say, let's decide whether we're really going to make a commitment to each other and get married. And obviously, people have all sorts of reasons why they might want to get married. So what I wanted to do in this podcast is just share with you, for me, what is the really important thing underlying the difference between just loving each other and staying together and actually making a commitment like you do when you get married. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what marriage means. I don't think you have to take on any parts of marriage that don't apply to you. If you make a commitment to each other and you make that commitment publicly, then you don't have to involve any religions. We certainly didn't. You can choose to have whatever kind of wedding you want or anything else. But this is why you would be doing it in the first place. And that's what I didn't understand. So I thought I would just share with you how I changed my mind about marriage. I am very happily married. I do find it to be a difference having made that commitment. It's a difference for myself too, in terms of how I think about my relationship with my wife. I already loved her before we got married. Getting married was more about me making a commitment, which changed my attitude towards the future. And I'm really happy that I did it. And given that I came from a totally different background and had very different ideas about marriage when I was a kid and growing up, I thought I'd share those thoughts with you. I hope you found that interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.